So now that we have some idea about what Corpus Railjack is going to look like, as well as the Commander intrinsics, I think it's now a better time to get back into talking about Railjack stuff. So we're going to be expecting some Railjack stuff early next year. So let's go with the Railjack Basics Guide. We've discussed how to get into Railjack as a mode previously, as well as what the weapons are like. So now I want to go into something that I kind of alluded to in the weapon video, which is of course the damage types. So let's begin. The big takeaway about Railjack damage is that we have a much more simplified system, in the sense that combined elementals simply don't exist. Because combined elementals don't exist though, when you're modding for your arc gun, it does make it a little bit more tricky, so you're going to have to figure out how you want to mod your arc guns, taking that into account, okay? The main thing is that there's less damage types as a result, which does mean that a larger majority of them, I believe, are super duper useful. And also, one thing I like about the Railjack damage system as opposed to the regular WarFrame damage system is that there's just simply no double ups. So, what do I mean by that? Well, let's just go through each damage type and I'll explain what I mean as we go. So, the first one we're going to have a look at is the Ballistic damage type, which comes from impact damage if you happen to be modding. So impact damage becomes Ballistic damage. So what happens when a target is affected by Ballistic damage? Well, they actually become what is known as concussed. So fighters, and with the possibility of cruise ships as well, are concussed. That means that they have reduced aim and damage for 6 seconds. Proccing Ballistic again will thusly refresh the duration, so you could potentially have a very long duration based on the gun that you're using. The damage reduction amount, as of right now, I'm not entirely sure what the damage reduction amount is, because I don't tend to use this particular physical damage type a whole lot. And that is because this particular damage type is not represented in any Railjack weapons, so that's basically why. Essentially though, this particular damage type works like a blast and puncture proc together, so that does mean that two of the previous damage types from the regular damage system, they're basically merged together to create Ballistic. I suppose, in theory, this particular damage type can be useful for surviving a cruise ship in particular, since they do a lot of damage against arc wings. So if you have a weapon that has a lot of extra impact damage for your arc gun, this is probably a good idea. Ultimately though, I'm not 100% sure about this because again, I don't really use arc guns in Railjack. This is going to be the one damage type where I have next to no experience with at all. The next one is, of course, the plasma damage, which comes from any weapon that has puncture damage. So, when cruise ships and fighters are affected by plasma damage, they are actually decompressed. What that means is that there is a reduced amount of shields and armor for 20 seconds. Putting more stacks of plasma damage onto a single target will increase the amount of shield and armor reduction. What do I mean by that? They have less shields then, less armor. Essentially what you're looking at is a progressive with an infinite stacking mechanic of corrosive and magnetic procs. So that does make it really, really strong. Keep in mind as well, and I do need to emphasize this, this will affect both shields and armor, so it will also be useful against Railjack as well. This damage type is actually represented by every single Railjack weapon except the Cryophin. Again, this is why I hate the Cryophin. The main thing about it is that when you use a Railjack weapon that has plasma damage, so except the Cryophin, you can then have about 10 to 15 procs on a cruise ship in Roost Warfield, and that will allow you to one-shot the cruise ship with a direct attack from the forward artillery cannon if you're using the forward artillery avionic. You're going to need a few more procs if you're not using the forward artillery avionic, because of course that will increase the amount of damage that your forward artillery does. But essentially, even pre-revisited, or as I like to call it, pre-visited Railjack, the plasma procs were pretty much the way that you can actually destroy cruise ships really, really quickly using your forward artillery. So, definitely a really, really powerful damage type, and because this is found in almost all Railjack weapons, this is actually the damage type that I use the most, so I personally find it to be super duper useful all the time. Next one is going to be particle damage. Now, particle damage comes from slash damage. Any fighters or cruise ships affected by particle damage are torn. What does that mean? They actually start receiving 7.5% more damage for 20 seconds. Additional procs will stack more duplicatively, so you do end up with more damage received as you stack more and more of those procs onto a target fighter or target cruise ship. You're essentially looking at a progressive viral proc. That's basically the idea. Now, this particular damage type is represented by the APOC series. So, apparently it used to be overpowered, then there was a nerf, and it has been brought down since. It used to be something like 20% more damage, I think it was, then it brought down to 7.5%. I think that's going to be okay, though I personally expect to see a small buff when Steel Pass Railjack eventually shows up. 7.5% does seem like a little low, I guess. I don't know, we'll just have to see. Keep in mind this also works when it comes to increasing the damage of a forward artillery cannon. So, same idea as the plasma proc. You only need a handful of particle procs and that should do the trick, but because the APOC does also have plasma damage as well, you could probably basically work with both of them at the same time. You probably only need about 8 of each in order to be able to just one-shot a cruise ship with the forward artillery cannon. Anyway, so it is what it is. It's a really powerful proc, and basically if you're able to stack that and plasma onto a target, you can do a lot of extra damage onto that particular target. So that's really good. Alright, let's now start off with the first of the elementals. So the first one, of course, is going to be Frost. Frost, of course, coming from cold damage. Essentially, when enemy fighters and cruise ships are affected by Frost, they are immobilized. So what does that mean? They actually just stop moving. But they do drift because of momentum. Keep in mind, you are in space. There isn't that much friction involved in space. So whilst they don't move and they don't shoot per se, they're still drifting, okay? Frozen enemies, you know, they're frozen. This damage type, of course, is represented by the Cryophin, but you will also find this damage type in the Void Hole. So, when you're using the Cryophin, obviously if you manage to freeze an enemy, that does help with aiming the Cryophin because they can't really move anywhere else, and they're definitely not going to be shooting you, so that's going to be really helpful. Whereas with the Void Hole, I find that it's really great that the Void Hole does have this frozen capability because it just helps the Void Hole suck the enemies altogether when they're not trying to fly away from the Void Hole. Of course, the Void Hole also has a buff on its sucking power, if that makes any difference, so that will make things a little bit easier for the Void Hole anyway, but essentially freezing enemies as part of the Void Hole is definitely something that is just going to work really well for the Void Hole. Generally, I feel like if you're already good at shooting guns, you don't really need that cold damage per se. If anything, you might as well just look for something else. But it's definitely really good for that Void Hole, like I said. Next one is going to be Ionic damage. Now, Ionic damage comes from electric damage, so just keep that in mind. When fighters are affected by Ionic damage, they are scrambled. So keep in mind that I don't think this works on cruise ships. I definitely wouldn't bother using this on a cruise ship because a cruise ship doesn't really scramble much. When they are scrambled, they actually start spiraling in a more or less straight line, but they do spiral. So that's going to last for about 6 seconds. I suppose if you manage to apply the proc again, then they will continue spiraling again, or you'll have to actually wait until they finish spiraling before you apply another one, and then they'll start spiraling again. Essentially, it kind of works like a fear effect from RPG games, so basically fighters just start flying off in different directions, and that's basically the idea. This particular damage type is represented by the Pulsar series of Railjack weapons, as well as the Avionic Blackout Pulse, so just keep that in mind. The Pulsar, of course, will only affect a single target at any given point in time, whereas the Blackout Pulse effect is an AoE effect, which does give everyone the spiraling out of control Ionic proc. Just keep in mind as well, one of the cool things about the Ionic proc is that when a target fighter is spiraling out of control, if they smack into a rock or a comet or something like that, they actually blow up immediately. That is just something that you could potentially use in order to sort of force an enemy fighter to crash into a rock and essentially be one-shotted like pretty easily. So this could actually be a really powerful solution in higher level Railjack gameplay to try and use your surroundings as a way of destroying fighters. And this is also the same with the Void Hole as well. I personally find this particular effect to be more detrimental than beneficial though. Generally speaking, when I'm fighting enemy fighters, it's actually in pretty open space with not that much to use for the aforementioned spiraling out of control, smash into a rock kind of effect. If anything, it actually just makes it more difficult for me to aim at the target when they're spiraling out of control, because they're still spiraling. They're still doing this. That does make it a lot more difficult to aim at the target, so I definitely wouldn't recommend it myself. But if you're actually really good at using Ionic damage for whatever reason, if for example pulsars are your favorite guns and you're just really good and you're used to that kind of stuff, then more power to you. That's definitely going to be the damage type that you would want to stick with. Alright, the next one is going to be Incendiary damage, and as the name suggests, you could basically figure it out. It's coming from heat damage. So essentially, fighters and cruise ships affected by incendiary damage are seared. They actually take damage over time for 6 seconds. Now, it turns out that additional procs on that heat damage will actually increase the damage over time, but not necessarily the duration. I'm not entirely sure if that is entirely true. Essentially, we're looking at a heat proc without the armor strip. That's basically what it is. This particular damage type is represented by the Photor series as well as the Fiery Phoenix Avionic. Photor will of course only affect a singular fighter, although some people reckon that the Photor does AoE damage. I'm not entirely sure if that's true. I've never noticed it doing AoE damage myself. If it does AoE damage in a very small range, so I wouldn't really look at it as an AoE weapon myself. But the Fiery Phoenix will apply Incendiary to any fighter that happens to fly through it. That's if any fighter actually flies through it. There are things that I don't like about the Fiery Phoenix, and that is one of them. I personally haven't really noticed the damage over time being particularly significant. Even using the Photor and even using a very strong Photor, I don't really notice the damage over time actually playing a particularly large role. But that's mainly because for near fighters, they're still armored, so of course that fire damage is going to do even less. I guess by that logic then, when we go up against Corpus Railjack, that damage over time is actually going to play a much better role in basically burning fighters to the ground, or I guess burning fighters until they just explode. That's basically going to be the idea. But either way, it's still something that is useful because it is still contributing to your damage output anyway. So if you happen to have Incendiary damage on your Railjack weapon, i.e. by the Photor or any new Railjack weapon that comes from Corpus Railjack, it's definitely something to use, so definitely keep an eye on that. The next one is going to be chemical damage, and this is actually going to be the last of the elementals because again we only have 4 elementals, 3 physicals, no combined elementals. That's the idea. So chem damage comes from toxin damage. So fighters and enemy cruise ships that are affected by chem, they're intoxicated. What does that mean? They start attacking each other for 12 seconds. Additional procs will actually refresh the duration of chem damage, so you could basically have chem damage on a cruise ship, for example, and then if you shoot it again and you activate chem again, you basically start the 12-second timer again. This is basically a radiation proc, and it's really good because this particular damage type is represented by the Carcinox, my favorite of the Railjack weapons. I personally prefer using this particular damage type against cruise ships in particular because what it allows me to do is it allows me to distract them with their own previously supposedly allied fighters. So then they start attacking their allied fighters start attacking them, and that gives me some time to actually line up my forward artillery without them firing at me. So that makes it really strong. Another thing as well is that allegedly allied fighters, even allied fighters that would just be attacking randomly, they can actually destroy a cruise ship. So if you manage to keep a target chemmed, essentially, if you keep a target cruise ship intoxicated long enough with enough fighters around it, you could effectively get the fighters to destroy the cruise ship. That is entirely possible. So that is something that I've never really done personally because it does take a very long time, but it is still something you can look into if you want to just play around with that instead. It's definitely something that fighters can do, at least against cruise ships that have been taken over. So it would stand to reason that fighters that have been intoxicated or a cruise ship that has been intoxicated can of course be destroyed by its fighter crew. According to the Wikipedia, each damage type apparently has the same damage bonuses and weaknesses as their regular counterparts. So for example, apparently Chem might be able to go through shields as much as the way the Toxin might. I'm not entirely sure if that's true. If a Carcinox can damage a shielded Corpus fighter without breaking their shields anyway, that will confirm it, but until then, I'm not entirely sure. I don't actually remember if that is the case during Scarspia, so we're just gonna have to wait and see. But I'm gonna have to press X for doubt on that particular idea for the time being. Ultimately, there are 2 physical damage types and 3 elemental types that I would define as pretty useful. The ones that I don't think are particularly useful maybe are Impact, i.e. Ballistic, and electric, ionic damage. I don't personally find them all that helpful, but if you like to use them, then more power to you. You should definitely use them. Like I said, I think that this particular damage system is a lot better than the normal damage system because we don't have any double ups. So if anything, I think it might be a good idea to replace the normal damage system with the Railjack damage system. And when it comes to double ups, what do I mean? We don't have a corrosive and magnetic double up. We only have one damage type that does both of them at the same time. We have blast and puncture coming together to form just one single damage type. I think that could be really, really cool. We have gas, toxin, heat, and slash that are essentially represented by Incendiary in the form of a damage over time. Now you could argue that there is a good enough reason to keep a separation between toxin and slash, but I mean if they're both going to do more or less the same thing, might as well just make it all one thing in the form of Incendiary and just have to do true damage, I guess. I don't know. Either way, let me know what you think about all this in the comments below. What do you reckon about the Railjack damage system? Is it more of that simplified damage system that just allows you to think more about the general fighting and not so much about how you want to build stuff in your WarFrame system? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. Otherwise, hope you guys enjoyed this. If you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more WarFrame content, and until next time, I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching. Bye.